Again, hello everybody. Zain Escobar is here with us today. She is the first executive director of Houston Freemanstown Conservancy, which she serves to preserve and protect the Freemanstown history for the benefit for the future generations. Together, they are telling the story of freedom. Through advocacy and preservation activities, she aims to promote culture and heritage tourism, preserve the historic tapestry of Freemanstown, and expand the historical knowledge and dialogue among residents and international audiences with the goal of global recognition of historic Freemanstown as the heritage district that transforms our understanding of emancipation to be the story of freedom. Prior to joining Houston Freemanstown Conservancy, Zion transformed ideas into action as a civil engineer and green infrastructure advocate by providing technical and project support to public agencies, private clients, international NGOs, and design firms from Texas to Silicon Valley and Shanghai. For her contributions, she has named Engineering New Record magazine's Top 20 Under 40 in Texas and Louisiana, as well as American Society of Civil Engineers Young Engineer of the Year. This year, she was recognized by Girls Inc. of Greater Houston as the recipient of a Elian Campbell Vanguard Award for being strong, smart, and bold. Welcome, Zion, and again, so sorry for being late. The stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. No worries. I'm glad we're all here. I'm glad everyone's still with us. I know we had rescheduling because of the ice storm and all of that. So I'm so thrilled to see you all here. I'm excited. I see lots of faces from Dr. Lombardi's design studio. So that's very encouraging. What I'll do is I'll go ahead and share my screen. If you can enable me to share my screen.
Yes, now you can. Like you said, we don't have also water, hot water right now in the house.
Oh no!
It's crazy.
Wow.
But
I'm so sorry to hear that, because I think we all went through that experience, and there's just no fun in anything you're experiencing there.
Yeah.
So what I'll do is confirm that everyone can see my screen. Yes?
Yes,
my presentation?
I can.
Alrighty.
I believe everybody
So
does.
as I mentioned, okay. So as you can see, the title that we're discussing today and the topic that we're discussing today is Equity by Design equals Liberation for Freemanstown. And I'd like to share with you a couple of details about things we're working on in Freemanstown, which is located in Houston, Texas. I'll give you some context about that. We'll talk about equity, we'll talk about design, and at the end, I'll show you how all of these efforts can really produce a sense of liberation for not just Freemanstown, but for communities of color throughout Houston if we succeed at this model. And I want to again give a shout out to all of the students who are here today who've been actually helping Freemanstown in these concepts and designs. I just want to thank you for your efforts and your support so far. Your work is being used and it's inspiring myself and others in our team to do great things. And so the question I want to start with today is really a prompt, right? Again, equity by design equals liberation. And as you saw in the summary for this talk today, what if the perceived success of public policy and development codes and infrastructure and urban planning actually hinged on equitable outcomes for a specific community? Not are they good and do they hold up, but how do they actually impact people, and is the impact equitable? Answering that question when we're trying to gauge success of certain things that are being done at various levels. And what we aim to show is that the rebirth of Freemanstown seeks to demonstrate how you can do these two things at the same time and actually have them support and benefit each other more so than if you did them separately, and how that is going to produce this liberation effect for this historically Black community in Houston. So just a quick little bit of background before we get into specifics about how things started, how they're going, where they're going in the future, and how do we stay on this path of equity towards liberation. Context for everyone here who's new to our organization, the Houston Freedmanstown Conservancy is charged with telling the story of freedom in historic Freedmanstown, which, as I mentioned before, is Houston's oldest African-American neighborhood, and it's located in the 4th Ward district. So many people have heard of 3rd Ward, thanks to Beyonce. People have heard of 5th Ward for many different reasons, but a lot of people don't have any distinct association with 4th Ward. And what you're missing out on is a great deal, and I'll share a little bit with you about that. As a conservancy, we were established initially as a mayoral task force in 2016, and we were formally designated as a 501c3 in 2018. So we are young, and that is to our benefit because there are many organizations, one of which I'll spotlight for you today, that have been in the community. And what we can do together is so much greater than what everyone has been doing separately over the last few decades to really bring about substantial and visible change in equity and infrastructure and quality of life for this community. And so, of course, our primary focus is to protect and preserve the history of Freedmanstown for the benefit of future generations. We support community engagement, re-education, and heritage-based tourism and events, and quite a bit more, actually. So just boilerplate, our mission and our vision, right? And so just to make it as simple as possible, our mission is education and awareness of this unique story. And our vision is that you actually change your understanding of emancipation, Juneteenth, those buzzwords, to be a story of freedom, and that you actually recognize what the story is and how grand it is and how much you've not been told in your history books and how much that means and how much that matters for what actually happens in real life on the ground in communities. So of course, our goals are supporting heritage district improvements, and I'll share more with you about that and how this, again, how A plus B equals C on the other side of things, and how advocacy can move towards this liberation, how community building and public education can get us towards that equity. And so through things as what seems as simple as events, activities, and programs, there's so much you can do to wake a community up, to activate a community, to care about itself, to honor itself, and to celebrate its history and its story because it adds value, not that it would take away from the value of the community. Of course, we support community engagement, as I said before, and collaborative leadership, which is incredibly important in this process. So speaking of that collaborative leadership, our core values, put simply, are to protect, preserve, educate, and engage. And we do this all on a spectrum with many, many different partners in action. Our entire network of action is how we're able to get this stuff done. And this is this seems like a benign graphic, but I'll share with you that the way to equity and the way to liberation is to get each of these folks on board with whatever they're able to do to move the needle in the way of arts and culture, communicating the value, getting funders to understand equity. So there's a philanthropy part of this, educating our philanthropic community, other nonprofits and collaborating with them, consultants and getting them to use their services for a greater good. Getting the media on board with what our intent is. And so the messaging can be communicated internal to the community and external to the community as to what we want, why equity is important, and what that actually means. Of course, you're engaging the academic community, which is why we're here talking to you all today, right? So you have an incredibly important role in how we move forward in the future with these conversations. The government and various agencies, of course, and I'll share with you our relationships and how we're going to use those things to actually bring about this outcome. The World Health Organization and community, big part of this conversation. So our core values are mapped around this plus several others that aren't shown here, that whole network coming to aid us in this goal. And so just a bit about me. It was shared earlier in my intro, but prior to joining the Conservancy, I was a civil engineer. I worked on green infrastructure and advocacy. And All of those things really are only important to share with you, because I want to share with you that no matter where you're at in this conversation, whether you're on the design side, whether you're interested in policy and planning, whether you're interested in the community facing issues, whatever part of the design, development, space making, culture and community curating, and action, whatever part of the action you're in, there's a place for you. I came from a very different space to come into this space to realize that all of these same tools are important. They just need to work together quite a bit better if we actually want to achieve equity. But it actually is possible now that I have the insights from being on the other side of the table, developing 30,000 person eco villages in Shanghai, for instance. You see all the things that can go wrong, and you find out what policies the Chinese government has that facilitates one set of actions versus another. And you take that and you map that to places like Texas and say, what can we do better? We are not China, we are Texas, and that's sometimes a good thing, sometimes a bad thing, but there's so much we can do to facilitate change coming about. One of those things, as I mentioned before, is collaborative leadership. If we're talking about equity, we cannot do this alone. Everyone on this call is part of that equity process. And so one of the grassroots organizations in our Freedmanstown community is the Freedmanstown Association. And I won't read everything here for you, but what I will share with you is that their goal since 1981, which was before I was born, by the way, their goal is to assure active and effective participation of Freedmanstown's current and former residents in the planning and the preservation, the restoration, and the development of the historical area. So you combine our heritage tourism, our community engagement, their preservation, restoration, and development goals, all of a sudden, we can start to solve the world's problems if we actually just work together as opposed to competing against each other, and things like that. And so, again, this is their mission and vision. They focus on affordable housing and economic development. They want to lead comprehensive and community-based housing revitalization and enhance the ability of low and moderate income families to achieve lasting economic viability. So they're concerned about the bottom line. They're concerned about the equity as well. We just have two very distinct paths in which we are trying to facilitate that equity, but we should and we are doing them together. And I want to encourage everyone to see things that way, that this is possible when we're actually all collaborating, even when it's hard, even when there are rifts, even when there's historical failures and things in the community. There's a path, especially at a time like now, to go forward together. So this is just a quick overview of their goals to show you there's kind of comprehensively lots of elements at play in the community right now in service of these goals that I'm speaking to you about. Okay, I'm going to pause and I'm going to take a quick little detour, and I'm going to share with you kind of where Freedmanstown started in Houston and what happened to it and where it's going. Okay, it'll give you some context for the conversation. We're going to get into the meat about equity and what that could look like and what that feels like. And then I actually want to engage you all. I'll stop in the middle of this presentation, ask you all some questions about what your understanding of equity is. So just a heads up, I will pause and ask you what you think equity is. So if you have something, please be ready to share that, if that's okay with everyone. So let's take it all the way back. 1836, Houston is founded, right? The Allen brothers, which founded Houston, they sold everyone, all of our European immigrants that came to settle this community. They sold them with this image. It looks like a beautiful European Swiss village, you know, a mountainside village or something. It does not look like Houston. If you've ever been to Houston, you all know that this is just not accurate. This is false advertisement in its highest form, and it started back in 1836, okay? So you're encouraging folks to come here and to settle here and make a home here. What I want to share with you is at the exact same time, Texas was not even Texas. It wasn't even part of the United States. 1836, the Battle of the Alamo is happening. And at that point, after that victory, Texas actually becomes no longer Mexico. Now it's Texas. And 3 short years after that, the Fourth Ward, which is where Freedmanstown is located, it's created. And so Fourth Ward, this historic community, has been here since the beginning of Houston, and many people have no idea, even people who live there now. And so there's a need here to reconnect that memory, and I want to show you how important that can be to equity. So fast forward a little less than 30 years, Texas emancipates its enslaved persons, and they migrate. And their biggest migration was up to the city of Houston. And so if you just look at the graphic here, you'll see that all of these green areas, that's plantation land, okay? So when you're looking at the map of the Houston region, that's really the story here that no one's really talking about. All of these plantations, all of the workers left there and started migrating for other opportunities to Houston and specifically to Freedmanstown because that's where they were allowed to settle as free Black people if they were looking for a better chance at life. And they took this incredible journey, and I'll share with you more about kind of what's coming in the pipeline as regards to equity and this story on a national scale and an international scale to help recount the story and why it's even important and worth telling a story that's so old, like why it even matters, right? Why do you care? So 5 short years after emancipation. So think about, you are an enslaved person. You have not a dollar to your name. You own nothing. You may not know how to read or write. You don't have any skill sets outside of the ones that you were forced to do over the course of your time being enslaved. This house turns some of that on its head. This is the Jack Yates house. I call it the house that Jack built. Jack Yates was the founder of the Freedmanstown community, one of the founders of the Freedmanstown community, and he built this house in 1870, 5 years after being emancipated. Think about all the skills that this man had to have to build this house. It's a Greek revival house. All the things he did under his time as a slave, he took those skills and he was capable of doing that and many, many more things for himself and his family, right? So think about all of the value that's been sucked out of the economy by these folks not being able to produce this for themselves, for others, for a profit instead of for free, right? There's an incredible economic loss there over the years. Now I'm moving through Freedmanstown history really quickly, gonna give you the high points. Don't want you to fall asleep. I understand it's late in the evening. So I just wanna share with you the early 1900s. Freedmanstown gets this reputation as the Harlem of the South. And I'm curious, has anyone heard of this moniker, this name for this community, the Harlem of the South in Freedmanstown? No, no, okay. So by 1915, over 400 Black-owned businesses existed in Freedmanstown. Everyone's heard of Black Wall Street in Oklahoma, right? This was larger than Black Wall Street in Oklahoma, and you don't know about it, and it's in Texas. There's something wrong there, right? You should know about this. It had everything from jazz clubs, beauty shops, restaurants, and the West End Park, which was the largest baseball park in Houston before Minute Maid Park came into existence. And that was in Freedmanstown. The largest Jewish cemetery in all of the state of Texas is in Freedmanstown, a historically Black community. All of these things have been developed over and erased in a certain way. And so that's the first hint. Where's this history? How did it become the Harlem of the South and no one knows about it and there's nothing left to look at? Well, that part's not true, and that's what I want to share with you today. One of the things that's left over from 1914 is the historic brick streets in the city of Houston, in Freedmanstown specifically. And you can see that downtown Houston, this is an old picture, but these bricks are now over 100 years old, right? And they're still intact. That is incredible. These people created their own businesses, their own schools, their own libraries. They paid to have these streets paved for their families to have safe travel during our wet months and the clay and everything. You don't want to get yourself dirty and mucky going to and fro from church to school. And now you're a proud business person. You want to be clean. You have a standard for yourself. These are the pieces of infrastructure that show pride and resilience. So you take this thriving community, 95% of Black Houston, by the way, during this time before this period I'm showing you now, 95% of Black Houston lived in Freedmanstown. All of these other places that you know of, all of those places grew from Freedmanstown. So Freedmanstown was the mother ward. It was where all those places kind of grew from. Just the high points here. In the 20s, there were racist housing restrictions that segregated Black people. 30s, there was property laws that took property away from Black people. So think about it. You're free. You can now try to earn your money, but there are very systematic things. There are policies, there are codes that will keep you from thriving, even though you're capable of so much more. In the 1950s, 40,000 residents were uprooted from the construction of I-45, which I'll show you where that is on a map here soon. But just think about this. From the 20s to the 50s, within 30 years, there were so many things that were destructive that this community did an about face as far as its productivity. It went from being the Black Wall Street to a very, very quickly declining community of color that was shunned in some ways. But that's a matter of choice. It's not a matter of failure. So 70s to today, there are city planners and all sorts of folks doing things that continue to displace people. And people think that they are in Midtown. People have heard of Midtown in Houston. And what you don't know is that City Hall and Midtown and several of these other places in downtown Houston, all of those sit on what used to be Freedmanstown before that land was taken away. And so when we talk about equity, you can see that there are a lot of things that have changed, and there's maybe a need to have a conversation about equity here. And so what I want to encourage you to do, not here in this conversation, we don't have time to share the videos that I usually would love to share with you all, but on your own time, put in YouTube, Who Killed Fourth Ward? And you're going to see a 3-part documentary that's from the 70s, which is this gentleman here who's the reporter. And I'm going to actually just pull a couple of quotes from that for you here today, but I really encourage you to go and check out that documentary. It will explain to you why there's a need, a deeper need for equity in this community. When you see what it was versus what it is, and I'll show you some demographics and things like that, you'll say, oh my gosh, I did not know that. And I can see why people are pissed off. So I want you to be a part of this story and to understand that it wasn't just the poor or the wealthy that killed Freedmanstown. It was a systematic process that got to this point. And so what you see here in the quotes is that they're interviewing, in this documentary, they're interviewing the president of the Chamber of Commerce. And they're talking about this place nearby, which they're referring to Fourth Ward. And they're saying, the nearby part, Fourth Ward, is occupied by poor people and is owned by wealthy people who are paying far less than their share of taxes. This is and has always been about money. And so when we talk about equity, follow the money. Where's the money leading you? What questions and what decisions have been made that created winners and losers? And that's how you can seek to actually create these opportunities for equity. And so the interviewer is saying, eventually Fourth Ward will become part of downtown, do you think? And he said, oh, there's no question on it. And this is him speaking in his jargon. And if a proper tax were put on it, it would happen really fast, pretty fast. It will happen. So from the beginning, there's been an intention that Fourth Ward will be absorbed into downtown. Now, why is that important? Why is that important to you as you go out and think, as you get engaged and you're brought, if you're a student, as you go into your professional space? What you need to be on the lookout for is that there's this example you heard of called Fourth Ward, and it is tragic as heck, okay? But it also, there's opportunity for liberation. But the reason why that tragedy is of importance to you is because Fourth Ward represents a microcosm of all the problems that affect and afflict poor people. And that's not an exaggeration. And the students who I see many of you on today, I look forward to opening up for dialogue so you can share some of what you've been learning about this place. But you'll see how it's a microcosm of many different things. And that the reason why you should think this is important is because what has to happen is that everybody has to get concerned about it. Because while it's Fourth Ward today, it might be them or you or the neighborhood you're working in or working on tomorrow. And this is why this is a precautionary tale. Let us be the canary in the coal mine for you when you're moving forward and everyone's asking questions about equity. Be able to look back at this community and track this community and what we're doing as far as equitable development as a benchmark, what we're getting right and what we may get wrong. So I encourage you to continue to bring that lens to your practice, whatever your practice is going forward outside of the academic environment. So I mentioned that I was going to ask folks what they thought equity is. You know, what is your perception of what equity is, what it looks and feels like? And I'll share with you just a couple of bullets of kind of what I think equity is as it relates to the space that I'm in right now. I think there's a larger conversation for equity, but more than anything, equity should improve and promote justice. Equity should provide impartiality and fairness within procedures. So that's development, policies, codes, think redlining, Jim Crow laws, prohibiting property ownership by persons of color or making it more difficult for them to own properties and build wealth, legacy and things like that. So equity is improving processes and distribution of resources and rewards by institutions or systems. So all the framework in which we all operate as designers, developers, thought leaders, activists, whatever space you're coming from, there are processes and distribution of resources that really gets down to the nuts and bolts of where equity falls flat on its face. And if you had persons like yourself in various institutions, no matter what field of work you're going forward with, if you are looking for those opportunities to make sure that the process acknowledges equity and promotes justice and impartiality, and that there's some distribution of those resources fairly and rewarded, rewards that are embedded into things that systems and institutions are doing, that's another way to promote equity. And so equity, tackling equity requires an understanding of the underlying or the root cause of disparities within our society. And that's really why we're actually talking today, is I'm sharing with you the story of Fourth Ward, not so that you can just come visit or know about it, or follow us on Instagram and keep up with us and support us and chime in and share your ideas, but that I want you to understand that if you don't understand the root causes of disparities in the community that you're about to impact, you stand a chance of being that person who's exacerbating inequitable outcomes. So don't be that person. I want to give you the tools to start looking at things through a different lens, so that these landmines, you're not helping to place them essentially for people in the future. So this is a graphic that many have seen and has been shared on the internet. But what I want to share with you is there are a lot of folks who are like, oh yeah, I agree, man. Everybody should have a chance. Everybody should get like, you know, the same opportunity to go after things. That's equity, right? Like everybody should get a chance. And what I want to show you here is that equity, equality, meaning is everyone getting the same chance to do the same thing. You can see here that a bike does not work for everyone, and the same size bike does not work for everyone. It will cause imbalances and inequity. This little girl is going to have a hard time riding to school safely every day. Just because you gave her a bike, she does not mean she will succeed at doing what it is you want her to do, to be active, to drive, to get herself to and from school, to get out of a car, to enjoy sunshine, whatever the thing is you're trying to promote, right? Walkable spaces and transit-oriented development. Not everybody needs the exact same thing. Equity is when you get the right size solution for the right end user. And I just want you to come to the conversation with that frame of reference. Equality is not equity, even though they both sound like very benevolent things, they have very different outcomes. And Freedmanstown has had a lot of equality efforts, but none of them have actually been equitable. And that's what's missing. So we're going to talk about memory. Obviously, we're talking about a historic community. There's a lot of legacy there. And what I want to impart upon you is that in order to understand the true memory of a space, you have to meaningfully engage the people who embody the stories and the memories. This is not an add-on after you're going through your process, right? And I'm saying this to you, but I'm saying this reaffirming what our ambition, what our goals are, and what is our core values and our principles that we're using to operate to achieve this equity towards liberation outcome. And so, as I mentioned, we aim to demonstrate equitable development and historic preservation working hand in hand. And the reason why is because the memory of this space is just as valuable as its existing and future infrastructure. And I want you, by the end of this presentation, to see how important that memory is and how valuable that is, especially when there's nothing else of this sort left for people to point to, for people to form a sense of self in reference to. There's so much value there. So overall, we're talking about infrastructure and in its many forms. That social infrastructure, the fabrics of relationships and communities, the actual physical infrastructure, that's the walkable places, the housing types, affordable housing, all these various things. But I want you to know about Freedmanstown. This community did not change overnight. I showed you a timeline of how it changed just in 30 years from the 20s to the 70s, right? And I want you to know it was suffocated slowly by disinvestment in infrastructure. So what you are doing in the infrastructure space and the planning and the activation of communities, a park is no longer just a park. A park is a very distinct act of investment to create equity. And I want you to continue to see it that way. So here's my affirmation that I tell myself and I tell other people. You can't do this without us. Pick who the us is. The us is you, the us is me, the us is the community you're impacting, the us is the city of Houston, the us is the academic community, the us is the tax holders, the renters, the passersby, the general person, layperson. Everyone is engaged in this process. And so effective communication engagement can be a powerful tool for creating better policies, addressing inequalities, and for fostering community support and ultimately building stronger communities. We all want stronger communities and we throw it around like a buzzword, but what are we actually doing to make sure that we can have a stronger community? Are we addressing the policies that make the community weaker or exacerbate imbalances in a community? Are we trying to address equity by providing paths to everyone becoming stronger in a said community? And are we getting community support from the whole community? And so I want you to not be guilty of putting community engagement as a line item in your budget and then saying, oh, we don't have time for it. Let's just rush through it. I don't want to have those difficult conversations. Those difficult conversations are going to be how you win at doing what it is that you will do in the future. Those difficult conversations are going to be the teachable moments. They're going to be those moments of awakening where you find out, now I know why they're hurting. And I know that there are at least two tools in my toolkit that I can use to bring about a more equitable outcome. Even if what's being asked of you is not specifically that, you can approach it with the tools and the mindset that you need to create and act for better policies and things like that. Or try to change them and create them yourself. So I'm going to share a graphic from the UT Design Studio. Again, shout out, UTSA Design Studio, Dr. Lombardi's class. Shout out to you guys for doing so much work so quickly on this community and really finding out what the fourth ward consists of, what the demographics are. And so when we talk about change, when we talk about equity, you may not initially understand why there's a need for that conversation. And I'll just share this with you. So in the 1860s, around the time this community was founded, the family consisted of this. It's 2.5, a mom, a dad, and 2.5 kids. Now you see 1910, it's the parents plus 2 kids. Now the 1990s, it's just 2 single individuals. Same thing in the 2000s and same thing in 2020. So this is decades of people exiting, families exiting, and the infrastructure is not there to support them. There's multiple reasons that they have to leave. And it's financial, it's taxes, it's the cost increase of living there, the lack of infrastructure to support a healthy lifestyle for children to be welcome there. I'll also share with you from the 80s to 2020, the change in income. And although you can't see the specific number, this is over 100,000 in 2020. This is obviously not even close to that. And so you can imagine how much change has happened economically in the community. And so you'll see here that in 2020, 50% of the population is employed in finance, insurance, real estate, they're professionals of some sort, management, and health. And I'll tell you 100%, that is not reflective of the African American population that lives here, because the African American population are renters. So alert, when you look at demographics, and this is for the students in Dr. Lombardi's class, we're looking at this information. What I want to share with you is that this information does not account for the renters, because your renters don't show up all the time in your census and in your demographics. And 70% of Freedmanstown is renters, right? So you don't actually see them show up in this data. And what I would encourage you to look at is there's changes in race and average race throughout the time of this evolution of this community. In the 1860s, you can see there's 3 Black and brown faces, and that's changed. It used to be in the 1990s, almost all Black and brown faces. And then there was an incredible shift in just 10 years, from 1990 to 2000. Look at what that ratio, what that swap looks like. That's gentrification, y'all. Welcome to Houston. Welcome to gentrification. In 10 years, this was completely flipped. And these are owners, right? This doesn't talk about the renters. There was so much exodus. There was such an exodus as far as renters that's not even counted here. And so what I want to share with you is, in going from this population, this map right here of the 4th ward, and how loosely populated it was, to where it went and it got more dense, and then where it is now, you can see these large, massive places. This used to be residential, y'all. This is downtown now. This is where Chevron and Enron used to be, and I'll show you some of that here in a second. But that's why this conversation of equity comes into play. So we've talked about the past. Let's pivot towards the future. What about now? The present tense, and the future. What are we doing to bring about this thing that we're talking about here, this equity? I want to show you just a couple of things, because you may not be familiar with this place. You haven't visited, you haven't seen about it or researched it. And so this is what it kind of looks and feels like. And I won't go through it for the sake of our conversation here. I want you to see that this is what this place looks like. This is a 150 plus year old African American church. It's the first church built of this sort in Houston, Texas, by Jack Yates, the same guy who founded Freedmanstown. This is in Freedmanstown. Guess what that building is? Chevron. How did Chevron get in Freedmanstown? There's some conversations and some changes that happened there, right? These are all historic places here. These are the historic cemetery I was mentioning to you. And you can see this is right in the backdrop of all this development for the city of Houston. And with this, I'm going to stop, and I'm going to go back to what we were talking about. And I do want to make good on what I said I want to talk to you guys about, which is, what is your perception of equity? I've shown you a little peek before we go forward too much more and start talking about solutions and ideas. I do want to hear from everyone, or at least 1 or 2 people. What's your concept of equity, especially maybe in light of what I've shown you right now? Why would you want to have a conversation with this? Or do you have any feedback or thoughts about equity, or maybe how your perspective is evolving on what equity looks like? Feel free to speak up. See that? Let me know if that's okay.
Of course,
Okay.
Please do.
Sure. My name is David. When I think of equity, I think of ownership. Like on the financial side of any real estate project, it's equity, and you have to, for a community, kind of what are the opportunities for ownership. Crowdfunding is really interesting in thinking about. Is there, how do you provide those opportunities, or is it only outside money that gets to participate in this kind of this growth, this economic growth, as neighborhoods change?
Yeah, absolutely. That's, like you said, find out where the money is coming from, right? That's how you find out what the equity is going to look like. Who's funding the equity, and what do they want out of it? Now, I'll share a bit more about that as far as kind of where we're at in that process. Anyone else? Equity, thoughts, feedback?
I could share something. First of all, thank you for this lecture. I've been learning so much, and I really appreciate what you're doing. As far equity, what I think of is just as designers, how in school we always talk about like what you put on paper will get built and will affect people. So I think this is even like firing up that even more and putting more of like, I call it the burden of architecture, where it's a good burden, but it's also once you know you can't do, you must do something about it. And that's why I call it the burden of architecture, because the more you dive in and the more you find out, it's like you have to realize the impact you will have. And so that places more of an emphasis of being educated and, like you said, having those uncomfortable conversations and even like engaging the community of where you will be impacting. So this is really awesome what you're doing.
Thank you so much. I'm glad you're not asleep. And you're right, it is a burden on architects and designers to really start to solve these problems in a very real way. I think everyone's expectation has changed. So people are up in the ante, and now you guys actually have to start thinking about this critically and speaking about it. And so I'm happy you're here to start that conversation and get your wheels turning. Anyone else? Other than that, I'll go ahead and proceed unless we have anyone else who wants to give any feedback.
I was gonna say something. Sorry. I just was gonna agree with what she had said. That like I really appreciate the conversation because I feel like in the workplace it is definitely neglected. People aren't really thinking about the people; they're more so thinking about the business. So I feel like bringing like attention to this topic early, like to like undergrads. Like I didn't even know they're like, because I have a couple of friends from Houston. I didn't even know like this was something that is being done and thought about. So it is nice to like realize that even if you're like in the architecture or engineering field, you can still like make a difference in that way. Because I'm in engineering, but you know, so some same thing, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm an engineer and I'm making a very different impact than where I started as far as development and guiding the master plans. Anyone who touches a master plan at any point in their career in any way has an opportunity to create equity. And it is now your burden to at least think about it. You know, at least think about it and be aware and be prepared for conversations. And maybe you could be an advocate in the room. That's what I've been. And that's honestly part of how I got where I am today, is being willing to stand up and have that conversation without being threatening, to just say, let's ask some questions. How did some of this stuff came to be? You know, how did this come to be? Okay, well, I appreciate that. Any other comments or feedback? Okay. Move the graphics off to the side there. Okay, so what you're seeing here on the screen, as I mentioned, these are just a couple. There's more, but these are just a couple of those historic assets that have been restored. So one, for the architecture nerds, adaptive reuse can really be a tool for liberation. And I don't know if people would normally frame it that way, but I'm encouraging you to be so bold, because we're doing that here in Houston and people are responding to it in a very, very real way. So for instance, this little house right here was the son of Jack Yates, the first Black print press. He published all the Black newspapers historically in Houston. And so this is an incredible place of history. And now it's a museum and things like that. But this house used to look tragic. It looked so awful. But they did adaptive reuse, and I think 90% of the original structure was maintained and restored from I forgot what year it actually is, I apologize, but the early 1900s, and it may have been the late 1800s even. And it looks like a normal house today. And so this place is serving to carry this story forward. Just real quick, I want to make sure that we're getting on to our next part of our discussion, but I just want to show you the impact and the boundary here. This is I-45. Right? This is the highway that bisected this historically Black community and took out everything in between. There used to be the first colored Carnegie Library. The colored high was here. The Weston baseball field, the one I told you about, that was the largest. It was under I-45. So I-45 took out 3 major institutions that would have made this a family-centric place for Black people to stay and to thrive, even though they weren't welcomed elsewhere. And so this is our area of impact. Even though Freedmanstown is historically was much bigger, this is what we aim to recover and to work on right now. So as we move forward, we're talking about this liberation, right? What does it look and feel like, and why do we care, and how's this all connected into equity? I promise you it'll all come together. And I actually see a comment here, I don't want to miss it. Economic segregation often creates demographic inequality. Houston is notorious for its lack of zoning, amen. How has this affected these historic cultural areas? Well, I'll tell you, this economic segregation and this demographic inequality and the lack of zoning is exactly why Freedmanstown has suffered as much as it has. Because you can put whatever the heck you want on any block with just indiscriminately without restriction. And so some of the things we're doing in that policy area that I'll show you here in the coming slides is to reverse that impact and to create tools without zoning, because of course we do not want to be guilty of saying that this is zoning, because Houston just does not want it, although it's working very well for many other places. We're not trying to change that. We're trying to adapt with what we have to ensure equitable outcomes, given the framework that we exist in. And so as we're envisioning the future, I want to show you that it's not just policy, it's not just ideas, it's not just the money. When you're looking at real estate, when you're looking at development, there are many, many ways to do development. Development can be equitable, and it can tell the story of the people who live there. And you can do that while protecting and preserving the community. So we have many vacant lots throughout the community. And so Dr. Lombardi's studio, all the students there have been coming up with tons of ideas, and I'll capture just a few of them. And I'm sorry I couldn't put all of them in this presentation because they're so great, but I'll just capture a few of them. But what I want to share is that when we're looking towards the future, what if your art actually celebrated all the leaders and all the history of that place? What if the restoration of these shotgun homes initiated the sense of nostalgia to where these are, I mean, people are going wild over tiny homes. Well, shotgun homes are just tiny homes waiting to be loved, right? And so what if you do that? What if you do that over and over and over again, and you make it affordable so that you maybe have densification, but you also have affordable housing, but you're keeping the tapestry and the fabric of this community's architectural memory and what they grew up with, and why they were used to what they were used to and what that means. Just a quick aside, the shotgun house is an architectural style that came from Africa, and it came to New Orleans and made its way to Houston and all, of course, throughout the South. But this architecture and this typology is an African architecture. It's not just what a lot of people have heard of, is you can shoot a gun from the front door to the back door because it was just straight and narrow. That's also something that got attached through culture and history and time. But know that this is African architecture in America that has been retooled and repackaged. So what if your parks and your green spaces allowed every different type of person in the community to come here, right? And what if it actually honored the people, the strong individuals who created that legacy of success and resiliency and determination and financial empowerment back in the day, to remind the people, the little Black boys and girls who live here now, that you have something to be proud of. You don't have to be ashamed to be in a poor neighborhood or to be in public housing. The land that you live on has a history to it, and it's beautiful. You should not shy away from it. You came from something greater than what you see outside your front door right now. Therefore, you should aspire to something greater. With that, you have opportunities to create equity. You are encouraging people to see themselves as part of a larger story, not just what they have or they don't have today. And so you'll see ideas here. I'm not going to go into it. You can kind of see kind of the visuals and the idea. But I did want to share with you one of these ideas, and this may look familiar to some of you guys. So this historical promenade, which was one of my favorite ideas that was proposed from the group, right? This again is infrastructure. This is a treatment of a sidewalk. And with something as narrowly focused as what you do with your sidewalk improvements. All the local, the walkable places and ordinances that are going on across America and transit oriented. What if you suggested that in that sidewalk, in these transit oriented paths, these bike lanes, whatever it is, maybe, I mean, a sidewalk is better than a bike path, that what if you allowed something that allows you to navigate the community, to understand the story of this place and remind people of their sense of place? What if in the places where historic homes and things that were valuable to people who've lived there for a long time, where they've been demolished, what if you actually put up the skeleton of what was there at its place? And I love the terminology and the things that were shared from the students. Again, this is from Dr. Lombardi's class, and I'm sorry, I don't remember exactly who, what groups specifically worked on it. I encourage you guys to share your names after we're done and take credit for your work. But what if you put those houses in these spaces? And these become spaces of not just memory of what the architecture was, but they become programmable spaces, and there's variation. You have one that has education, one that's a playground, one that has a garden aesthetic to it, an art gallery, and a cafe. These are things you can do with a shotgun house with no walls, right? So anyone who can build a gazebo can build the structure of these simple architectural forms and actually program them to where they can be deconstructed and moved around. And that's how you make art and culture and memory something fun. I don't know about you, but I know a lot of people I've shared this concept with, and they're like, I will come to Fourth Ward to visit that because that is dope. Like, that's cool. What, you're gonna have something on this lot and have it be a cool program that we can experience and do our augmented reality stuff in. And then one day you're gonna have another house that does this. And all of that is to get people to understand the importance of the place that they are in. Caitlin, she says she loves that idea. It honors the space and utilizes it in a beautiful way. Thank you, Caitlin, for that feedback. So another idea, these are concepts and precedents formed and collected from the class. And I have to just zoom to one that is my favorite, and it's this bad boy right here. What if, in reminding this community of its heritage of being the Harlem of the South and having these jazz clubs and all of these famous musicians who used to come here because they could not stay anywhere else, by the way. So all of the famous musicians came to Freedmanstown, stayed there, and were boarded by these community members. And there was lots of ideas and creativity that was being shared in those spaces. What if you reminded people, new residents and legacy residents, of that history by having this full scale piano to where, you know, you're having the music come out above, and this is getting kids to engage in something where they're not just stomping their feet, making noise, they're creating music. And now they can say, wow, I know the story of this park now. And you name it after a person who was an influential person. So create spaces that have a depth and a reverence towards reminding people of where they are so they're not confused and they don't think they're in Midtown. They understand very well that they are in Freedmanstown, and this place was incredibly important to a great many people. And you honor that history and that legacy with every creative and educational space that you propose, right? Don't just make parks that speak to people's hearts, that speak to the history, to the story, that inspires another generation to ask why that person was important. And these are other beautiful activations, intergenerational connections. We're talking about community gardens, active spaces, and things like that in this community. So I'm gonna fast forward to what are we doing to actually protect this space, which one of our previous questions was about, right? How does this affect the area, and what are we gonna do about it? What we are doing about it right now is we are creating historic district clusters. And you can see here in this graphic, so these are these historic brick streets that were built in 1914. Here are the assets, the major assets that are along that path, things that are left that didn't get burned down or got burned down and rebuilt, because many things were burnt down intentionally to erase this history, right? So you see I-45 coming through here and Antioch's over here, this red dot, that just shows you all of this was Freedmanstown. Buffalo Bayou, all of that was part of Freedmanstown. Buffalo Bayou is the original location of where Freedmanstown began, on the banks of Buffalo Bayou, before it expanded into this area properly. So we're doing protected landmarks. We're working on what could be Houston's first conservation district. which will allow us to actually have a policy and a tool to curate what type of development goes forward, and that it's mindful of the history and the architecture, the lot layout, the spacing, all sorts of massing and design guideline focused things. All of those things are going to be tools that we're going to be able to guide future development towards. So this place looks like what it used to be in some ways. You can still build housing, you can still build affordable housing, and you can still have residents of all sorts come in, but let's have it look like what it did in its glory day to a certain extent, especially for the heritage tourism use. I won't go through all of these things because we'll cover a couple of them coming up. But again, this is just a view of what this proposed heritage district, which I've been hinting towards, I want to share with you. We talked about a conservation district in the last slide. That's one tool that essentially is an overlay that kind of supersedes zoning, that allows us to guide what the infrastructure and the architecture looks like going forward. And then we have this heritage district, which is a political boundary that the Conservancy and myself will be leading the operations, maintenance, and programming of. So all the ways you can activate, think of a cultural district or arts district. Well, this one's about heritage, and art and culture and food and architecture and history intersect to create a heritage district. So think about all the ways you would develop a community and how many different ways you can honor the stories and the legacy of those people in that development. That's how you start introducing equity. Don't build things that are great for people on the other side of town. Build things that show people what this place is, who it was made for, and people take pride in that. And you give them a sense of liberation by seeing their story reflected to them in an honest and valuable and true way that acknowledges so many things that were erased or were intentionally hidden. That is how you start to bring about equitable outcomes, uncover the things that are hidden, but bring them to everyone as a mutual benefit so that everyone can enjoy public spaces, but everyone's going to learn the history about these spaces in the process. So one of the things we're doing is we're creating a visitor center. And I won't go into too much detail because I know we're short on time, and CDF, let me know if I need to cut off early. I know we started a bit late.
We're good. I believe we're
Okay, if you guys are still with me, I'll go a little bit more, and we're going to wrap up pretty shortly. I can't wait to talk to you and ask questions and answer questions, but I'll go just a little bit longer. So I just want to show this to you real quick, and we'll move on from it. But there's so much there's so much detail here. Just know that this community engagement hub is going to be the first strike of lightning that's going to precipitate many beautiful things being created in the community, reminding the community of its former self and restoring equitable outcomes in the process. And you'll see what those things are here next. So obviously, I told you one of our primary purposes is heritage tourism. That's the end goal. But to get to heritage tourism, there's lots of things you have to do along that path. You want to give people tools to be able to experience. Why is this place important? Because I look at it, I see apartment buildings and some old raggedy houses. Well, there's a lot of stuff in between that you don't see. And so we want to uncover that hidden history by giving you an augmented reality. So we are developing that right now. And basically it'll combine historical photos and modern photos and video and social media and events, pop-up events into this augmented reality experience where you can look at something as it is today and say, wow, that looks awful. Or wow, this looks very, very modern. And you can see what was there before. And that's going to trigger some questions for you. When you see a huge apartment building built on top of what used to be affordable homes for Black people that now have to go and live elsewhere, you can say, who made that decision and what was driving that decision? And I promise you it was money, because you can make a lot more money from an apartment building than 10 single family residential homes. It's just, where was the community voice in deciding to tear those structures down and or save them? And was there anyone advocating for adaptive reuse and for augmenting what was there as opposed to removing and erasing it? This app will allow you to experience the community in a virtual way before and after, and where we're going in the future, and engage you in that story. So those ghost houses, you would be able to use that app in there and tap a QR code and be transformed into another place, seeing and experiencing things in a way that would otherwise be difficult to do without an incredible budget, right? So this is how we bring about equitable outcomes. We inform the new residents of where they are in ways that are accessible to them and to the people who used to live here. We're working on a Freedmanstown Atlas project, which essentially is like Google Earth, right? It goes from the 1800s to 2020 and beyond, and you'll be able to scroll through time and see what was there. The example you're seeing on your screen right now is actually Rice University. They've done this for their own campus. And so we actually formed a collaborative project with Rice University and received a grant from their Race and Anti-Racism Research Fund to produce this for Freedmanstown, to tell the story of Freedmanstown and what has come and gone, and to do a story map of all those things. But essentially, think of, if you want to do scholarly research, all of the efforts that Dr. Lombardi's students are doing right now, those outputs are going to go in to this atlas that the entire city of Houston will experience. And the intention is that this atlas will expand just beyond Freedmanstown, and it will go the full 51 miles of this Emancipation Trail that is here that I can show you in this graphic. So, how do you get to these equitable outcomes? If you haven't heard, if you haven't gone to our social media, if you're not subscribed to our newsletter, then you might have missed the fact that in 2020, Donald Trump, which surprised me, okay? It surprised me, and I had to take a moment of pause. Donald Trump signed the Emancipation National Historic Trail Study Law, which brought our bill that my board president testified on the floors of Congress to get passed, along with Sheila Jackson Lee, who's a Democrat, and Senator John Cornyn, who's a Republican, a bipartisan effort signed by Donald Trump to facilitate this incredible project, which will document the emancipation experience. So basically, what happens the day after everyone is freed? Where do they go? What do they do with their lives, right? That's an incredible story that you don't know about. Everyone hears about slavery, but you don't hear about the successes of how people were surviving and thriving against all odds, and where they did it, and what they created, and what they left behind. And so this trail will acknowledge that. And just because we're in the company we're in right now, I'll share this slide with you. But why would one want to celebrate and commemorate the Emancipation National Historic Trail? Like, why does it matter to you if you're in San Antonio? Well, you know the impact of having a National Park Service tourism attraction, which is the Alamo, the Missions, the World Heritage Site. Excuse me, not the Alamo, but the Missions, and being a World Heritage Site. That's an incredible economic opportunity. That's a place for visitors to come and contribute to an economy that has been declining. So this trail, it's currently in the planning phases, and of course, COVID is hampering some of that planning and organization and community engagement effort. But once it is on the other side of the planning stages and the study stages, and it's gone into implementation, this will be the second African-American trail to be recognized by the National Park Service park system. And all along that route, there are UNESCO slave route project sites of memory. And so a lot of those are in Freedmanstown, and some of those are in Galveston as well. And so there's an entire swath of Texas, and I'll just share it here. There's an entire swath, this whole region has something to say about what happened the day after people were freed. And it matters so much, and there's so much interest in this story that the other precedent that I'll share with you is Selma to Montgomery, right? If you've heard about the Civil Rights Trail and the MLK Trail, people call it many different things, but in Selma, Alabama, which is not Houston, does not have the traffic and all that, the tourism that Houston does. They were able to garner $33 million in visitor spending. And this is a snapshot from the National Park Service. So there's all sort of third-party benefits that have come along from this incredible trail being experienced that actually talks about the nation's painful civil rights history, but everyone's coming to understand this story. And you'll see an incredible diversity of people participating in those trails, and it's creating jobs. So this is important to the entire state of Texas because it has an opportunity to generate a great deal of revenue for the state, just to acknowledge that experience. So you have equity and the opportunity for equity because there's now money being generated on this story. Then there's this other larger goal that we have, right? And it's becoming the second World Heritage Site in the state of Texas, besides you all in San Antonio. And so we have been having kind of the preliminary conversations to know that we'll be qualified. We're doing all the work to earn the designation to become a World Heritage Site. So all the policy things I was telling you about, these historic districts and protections, those are required. You have to have legal boundaries and buffers. You have to have those historic structures stabilized and in place. You have to have the right combination of food and beverage and activity and accommodation and a visitor experience that's curated. So we're doing all of these things in service to this higher goal of World Heritage Site designation, should we be nominated to get that designation. What I'll share with you, and you know more about this than I do because it's your backyard, and this again is a snapshot at a single point in time. But when the San Antonio missions kind of first got started and they were designated, they were expecting a $10 million revenue increase. What you got actually was $94 million in visitor spending, which is incredible. You know, like you can create 2 or 3 malls and they don't generate that much cash every year just by destinations. And so when we're talking about how do you get to liberation, I'll tell you this. You put money back in the pockets of people who've lived in these places, you make it attractive and you make it look like a beautiful place. Not look like, you make it a beautiful place that has the story and carries the history of that space. And you bring this money and these dollars and the investment that comes along with it, and all of a sudden everyone's willing to invest in something because now they know they have a return on their investment, right? These people who give big money to other things, to multi-million-dollar developments in suburbs and subdivisions, what if they can invest in the urban core right next to downtown and get $94 million on return? That is how you have a conversation with people about why this is attractive and why history sells. It does, it's specifically because no one is telling this story. So find the thing that's unique about the projects you're working on. Tell that story. There's economic value in telling the stories that are hidden. In every project and every opportunity you have, you can impart equity by acknowledging that history and providing economic opportunities for people to return and to celebrate that history. This is just a general timeline of where we're heading. Again, I mentioned our goal, 2028, is World Heritage Site designation. We're in 2021. In 8 years, we're going to have to do all the things to revitalize and rebirth this community. So all the efforts I've mentioned to you are all part of the path to get there. You need a visitor center. You need a heritage district. You need strategic planning and ordinances and emancipation trail bills and UNESCO slave route project designations. All of that adds to the investment value for your funders when they're looking at what is this place going to be and why should I care? I'm not personally attached to the story, but why should I care? So with that, that's where we're heading. Before we get into kind of how you can help and what you can do going forward, I want to open it up to question and to dialogue about, I know I've shared a lot of information with you all here today. I want to hear what you think about this and questions you may have as to how this all works out and how this all adds up to liberation and equity, or questions you just have in general about something I've shared. So floor is yours. Give me what you got.
Any questions? Comments?
All right. Well, I know it's late. And so what I'll do while everyone's thinking about their questions, if they have any, is I will share with you how you can help should you choose to. Okay. If you're saying, that's interesting, I'll think about these things. That gives me something to chew on. But what can I do today to actually help create that equity? There are multiple things you can do. So the Freedmen's Town Association, which I introduced at the beginning of this presentation, and I told you kind of what they're doing, right? We are doing community impact projects, partnering with existing grassroots organizations in the community. And so one of those projects is the restoration of historic affordable housing units. These homes are from, I think, 1930, and they're still standing and they need to be restored, and they were impacted by the ice storm. And so we have fundraising and help and things that we're going after to help with all the pieces that are necessary to get these places back up and going. But if just 25 folks donated $200 or 30 folks donated $100, we could be well on our way to supplying all the building materials or completely retrofitting the AC and heating units for these historic structures that are going to be, again, part of our sell as to this is adaptive reuse. You didn't have to build an apartment building on this complex. There's 12 residents in these 2 lots, right? And it's affordable. It's affordable housing and it's historic. And so I would encourage you to help at that, help with any of these things if you can. The other opportunity is that visitor center that I was sharing with you all, which again is an adaptive reuse of historic homes. The woman who leads the Freedmanstown Association grew up in this house historically, and these houses are going to be adaptively reused to be the visitor center. And so her legacy and her family's legacy, being 5th generation Freedmanstown residents, is going to be honored in permanent exhibitions there. Think about those opportunities in your projects as well. But if you're wanting to help, we're doing schematic design, community outreach, and again, 25 donations of 200 would equal schematic design. 20 donations of 100 would equal community engagement. And I've emphasized how important that community outreach is to getting successful outcomes and to getting everyone on board. And so the simple thing that you could do, if you choose to, is to text GIVE to 713-929-2109. And so take the number down if you don't have time right now. But a donation as small as $10 can actually put us over the needle. And what I'll share with you here is that 49 supporters, we were able to garner $61,000 in donations towards our $100,000 goal. And so 49 people made that much impact. You know, so at $10 and things like that, you could do reoccurring monthly. There's opportunities to really impact this community. And so enough about that. I want to see if anyone has questions, has thoughts, things like that. Any feedback, anything that you think maybe I'm missing and I didn't mention here that you think you're saying, hey, I have an understanding of equity and you totally missed the mark. I'm calling your bluff. Please call me out right now. Do it. Tell me what I could do better and what I'm missing and what you've learned. No one. Come on. Don't be shy. All righty. All right. Well, it's 7:30, and I understand that you know, we're all ready to move on with the other part of our evening, so I'll respect that. And I'll just share with you that we are thankful for you all. And this is another community impact project and the community coming out to clean up this historic prayer garden and labyrinth. That was the site of Mount Carmel Missionary Baptist Church, which was burned down years ago illegally. But this is the space that has come up in its absence. And just let you know that we are working hard at creating a very unique space with equitable outcomes. And so stay tuned more than anything. Find us on Instagram at Houston Freedmanstown, and that's Freedmen's, MENS. On Instagram is our best place to find us and see what we have going on. Just stay tuned. Ask us questions, challenge us. Come to our community engagement event we have going on at the end of this week on the 27th. You'll be able to find the info for that on our social media pages. Sign up for that. It's an Eventbrite, register. The students who are on this call are going to be presenting, some of them there, and their ideas will be presented. So come watch your fellow classmates squirm, if nothing else, and get feedback and hear what people are saying and what kind of feedback we're getting. It'll be everyone from a UNESCO representative commenting to the director of the planning department, to a descendant of Jack Yates, speaking about her reflections and her desire for the community. So come and join that conversation and keep up with us more than anything. With that, I'll again say thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Zion. It was excellent. And thank you everybody for joining us today. And sorry for my late start. I apologize again. And thank you. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll see you guys on the 27th.
Thank
Thank you, Zion, for that very nice lecture. Thank you.
And thank you, Angela, too, Dr. Lombardi.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Lombardi. Wonderful. All right. Good night, folks.
Thank you.
Yeah.